Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for African News with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, people in Juba are once again sent running for cover after gunfights break out at an army barracks on Wednesday. The South Sudanese military says that several soldiers are killed in fighting over a dispute over back pay. Also, here in Paris, the trial of Pascal SIMBIKANGWA has entered its fifth week. The Rwandan ex-spy chief's charged with complicity in the 1994 genocide in his homeland. We hear from our Nicholas Ramat, who was in court today. And this week, Italy's new prime ministers vowed to work more closely with North African nations in efforts to tackle the growing flood of illegal immigration from Africa to Europe. Campaigners in Rome are pushing for the government there to do more for those who make it across. First up, people in Juba were once again sent running for cover on Wednesday. This after gunfights that broke out at an army barracks on Wednesday. The South Sudanese military says that at least 5 soldiers were killed in fighting that broke out over a dispute over back pay. It happened at the same army quarters where clashes last December sparked the conflict in which thousands have been killed. Both the army and rebels backing former Vice President Riek Machar accuse each other of breaking a ceasefire as peace talks have stalled. France 24's regional correspondent Duncan Woodside joins us now with more. Duncan, now the South Sudanese government says that established rebel forces weren't behind today's violence. Does this mean that it's completely unconnected to the wider conflict? Fortunately, technical problems hearing Duncan there. We're going to hopefully get back to him a little later on in the bulletin, but do stay with us for more on that if you can. Moving on, the judge in the murder trial of Oscar Pistorius today heard that a month before shooting his girlfriend dead, the South African Olympian accidentally fired a gun in public. Witness Kevin Lorena testified that the weapon went off under a restaurant table in Johannesburg, and Pistorius convinced a friend to take the blame because he was afraid his involvement would draw too much media attention. Pistorius has pled not guilty to the murder of Riva Steenkamp last Valentine's Day. He claims to have mistaken her for an intruder when he opened fire. Here in Paris, the trial of Pascal SIMBIKANGWA has entered its fifth week. The Rwandan ex-spy chief is charged with complicity in the 1994 genocide in his homeland. Our Nicholas Ramat was in court for the testimony of a witness who says he lived in SIMBIKANGWA's house for several weeks during the mass slaughter of Tutsis and moderate Hutus.
This Wednesday, we heard a witness who was a 65-year-old businessman in Kigali, a Tutsi. He said that at the time of the genocide, he spent several weeks in Pascal SIMBIKANGWA's house, and he says that at the time he saw men coming to SIMBIKANGWA's house to collect weapons. The difficulty with this witness was the fact that he was in Kigali via video conference with an interpreter, and this made the questioning quite complicated, and this is something which the defense lawyers regretted strongly.
It was very complicated. It's not normal. We can't ask questions the way we want to. This trial, it's basically a succession of witnesses. We face these problems frequently, and the witnesses are very unclear.
We are now in week 5 of this trial, which should last 6 weeks, and we asked one of the main plaintiffs, ALAIN, how he thought this trial had gone so far. It's, of course, an historic trial here because it's the first time in France that a Rwandan is tried for complicity of genocide.
With this kind of trial, you are never sure of winning. I hope the jury will realize that Pascal SIMBIKANGWA's defense doesn't make sense. He just denies everything and says the witnesses' testimonies are fabricated.
The main difficulty with this case, we saw it again this Wednesday, is the fact that the genocide took place 20 years ago, and therefore many of the witnesses have a lot of trouble in remembering exactly what they saw and what they heard during the genocide. The court here will now give its verdict on March the 14th.
Okay, we're now going to return to our top story. That is clashes that have broken out in Juba, the South Sudanese capital, today. The army says that it was all over a dispute over back pay that broke out at barracks in the capital. Our correspondent, Duncan Woodside, joins us now with more. Duncan, so the government's saying that rebel forces weren't behind the fighting today. The country's actually been suffering, been in the midst of a conflict since December. Can we really say that the violence that we saw today was completely unconnected?
Well, that's obviously one theory initially being put forward, that this was purely a dispute over pay, that soldiers in the base were unhappy because they hadn't received their back pay, and the army was saying initially that 5 people died as a result of those clashes. But subsequently, the army appears to have acknowledged that the soldiers who didn't receive their pay or were disputing the pay situation were under the command of Gauthier. Now, this is significant because Gauthier is one of the few NUR officers, or one of the few senior NUR officers left within the army, which is, or who is loyal to the regime. And the regime, of course, is run by Salva Kiir. That's President Salva Kiir, and he's a Dinka. Now, the situation in South Sudan has largely been one where Dinka forces have been pitched against renegade NUR elements during this crisis. And so the fact that elements loyal to Guy appear to have been unpaid could represent a further ratcheting up of ethnic tensions on the military side.
Now, Duncan, has there been any other signs of flare-ups elsewhere in the country today?
Well, the situation in Malakal appears to have changed once again. Now, Malakal is a key city because it's the capital of oil-rich Upper Nile states, and the status of that town in terms of who it's held by has changed several times since the beginning of the conflict, with the rebels coming in, and then the government pushing them out, and the rebels coming back in again. Now, it appears this afternoon, according to sources on the ground there, that the rebels have now withdrawn from the city, and there is a power vacuum within the city, effectively no military elements there at the moment. Now, that may indicate that the rebels are consolidating and moving forwards to the northwest to try and capture the oil fields.
Thanks very much. Duncan Woodside there for us on the latest violence in South Sudan. Moving on to Egypt, where the terror trial of several journalists has been adjourned until March 24th after one defendant appeared in court with his arm in a sling and claiming to have been injured during his arrest. Now, Mohamed Fahmy, the Egypt bureau chief of international news organisation Al Jazeera, asked the court to release him for his injuries. He and 2 other colleagues are on trial, along with 17 other defendants, on charges accusing them of aiding a terrorist group and endangering national security. Authorities accuse Al Jazeera of working for ousted Islamist President Mohamed Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood. All those charged have pled not guilty. Staying in Egypt, the finding of the first official investigation into the fatal crackdown on a sit-in in support of Mohamed Morsi last year says that security forces used excessive gunfire and didn't give peaceful demonstrators enough time to leave. However, Egypt's Human Rights Council accuses gunmen inside the protest camp at the Rabaa al-Adawiya Mosque of escalating the violence by shooting at police. 624 civilians and 8 officers were killed in the clashes last August, making it one of the bloodiest days in the country's modern history. Well, that wraps it up from me for this bulletin. Before I hand you back for more news and headlines from around the world, we'll hear from Congolese musician KALMERY. Now, he's spoken to France 24 ahead of next Monday's fundraiser being held here in Paris in support of Central African Republic. Now, he'll be playing alongside other big names like Youssou N'Dour and Ray Lima. He says his own experiences of growing up in Democratic Republic of Congo made him particularly sympathetic to the troubles in Central African Republic.
I know all what you can see in Central Africa today. I've been going through this because I was young. I lost my father, and there's too much things happening. So it's just why I'm afraid, because there's something is missing, because there's no leaders in Africa that can bring people together and understand where they're going.